That's okay. Let's go and get the workshop started. We've got the workshop tonight on the comprehensive plan. It's 4 p.m. This is an informal meeting, so anyone in the audience has the opportunity to ask questions. It's going to be a dialogue, and Megan, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Rick. So I have been working with AJ Fauver with Verdenti. It's a firm that actually specializes in comprehensive plans and strategic planning. I had met her at an economic development conference. We kind of talked about the different options that the city has and how I thought it would be good if the city had a plan in general. Developing it was a lot harder than I had anticipated when we looked at strategic planning. We found what the issues were, but actually itemizing and breaking it down and giving it the structure it needed was a lot harder. So she's here tonight to present to council kind of the plan for the future and looking at a comprehensive plan. Most of our directors are also here this evening because this does affect the city as a whole. And so I'm actually going to let her take over. AJ, if you want to jump on in, make sure we can hear you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm going to share my screen. Give me just one moment. Okay, and can everyone see the screen okay?
Yes.
Yep.
And the slideshow was also provided in the packets, which were online.
Excellent. All right, well, thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'm very pleased to be visiting with you all virtually this evening for a short presentation and maybe some Q&A at the end if you have any thoughts or questions about the content that we're going to cover tonight and how you might be able to utilize it moving forward. As Megan said, my name is AJ Fauver and I work with a company called Verdunity. What we're going to do tonight is cover several different topics. I'm going to give you a little bit of background information about us, just so you know who you're talking with today and a little about myself. And we're going to spend most of the time talking about two different tools important in city governance, the strategic plan and the comprehensive plan. And the goal is to kind of lay an educational foundation for you all as to some of the features and the differences between these tools. We'll do a little compare and contrast. And then, of course, as I said, allow any time for questions that might be useful for you all to ask as you start discussing and decide what next steps you might want to take as you look ahead for the future of Alpine. So I'll tell you just a little bit about myself briefly. I come to you with some experience as a consultant. I've been with Verdunity for 5.5 years. And prior to that, I spent 15 years in the public sector working for cities as a planning and development services director. And I also served as the director for the Northwest region of APA Texas. APA is the American Planning Association, and there's a Texas chapter of which the Northwest section is kind of a regional area of 80 counties that include all of the Panhandle, parts of the Big Country, the Concho Valley, and even a little bit north towards the Oklahoma border. So covers a huge area and has a web of small towns and communities throughout it that all have very similar planning challenges. My path to planning was in large part because I grew up in small West Texas communities and I've had a very interesting experience at a young age and even as a teenager of hearing my friends and family talk about the communities in which I lived in a very different way than I experienced them. They would talk about the level of activity, the number of events that were always going on, all of the different businesses that were in place, and just kind of a prosperous type of community. And the communities that I lived in by the time I was of age were very different communities. I just didn't see what they saw. We were kind of experiencing a cycle of decline in some of those panhandle communities. And so learning why that happens and how to maybe get out in front of that and stop it is what motivated me to become a planner. And Verdunity was an area that really caught my attention as I was looking for a transition into the private sector. One of the main reasons I chose Verdunity as a place to land is because I wanted the opportunity to work with towns and cities of all sizes, which we do. And I liked the challenge of putting together a planning program there that focused on what we call fiscally focused planning, meaning that fiscal analysis and understanding the true cost of the decisions that we make is really the central lens through which we do all the work that we do at Verdunity. We provide fiscally based analysis for communities of all sizes, planning services, which is mostly what we're going to talk about tonight. We also do engineering, community engagement services, and then we also do what we're doing tonight, which is what we call strategic consulting, where we work with a client to find out what they might need and then tailor something to fit those needs in their budget. And so we work primarily to help community leaders such as you all achieve meaningful improvements with the resources that they have, because we understand that prosperity is cultivated. It's something that doesn't just happen, it's something that must be planned for and must be strategized around. One of my frustrations as a public sector employee was hiring consultants to do plans. I did that many times. And I was often frustrated by the products that I would get because the plans often had very large, overarching, far reaching goals that still needed to be translated into action for us to do anything about them. And frankly, relied on resources that I didn't have. I didn't have more staff coming down the pipeline. I sure wasn't about to get an infusion of cash in our general fund. And so we really like to take this challenge of looking at the resources you have today and helping you maximize those rather than depending on something that may or may not come to you in the future. And so here are some of the small towns that we've worked with, mostly again in Texas because we are Texas based, but we have worked with small communities and towns and other states as well. So we find that even across some of the different jurisdictional issues of various states, small towns often have a lot of the same challenges. And so those are fun to undertake in partnership with a governing body. So how do we do this?
AJ, are you moving the slides? Because they're not moving on the.
Yes, I am.
Yeah, they're not moving for us.
Okay. Well, let's
We're still on your, there you go. Now we're
try
working.
this one more time.
We got it now.
Well, you have my view, but you don't have my slides advancing. So let's try this again. How about now?
There we go. We're good.
Perfect.
Okay, great. Well, now you get to see the whole presentation and not just guess what I'm showing you. That'll work much better. So how we do this is a longer process. Sounds very comprehensive and cumbersome, but it actually is something that fits very nicely within the confines of the strategic or comprehensive planning process. We start by creating a baseline analysis to see how your city is performing and what things are most fiscally productive in your community. And we'll talk about what that means briefly here in just a moment. The reason that we do that is because we feel that it's really important that as you're planning for the future of your community, it's rooted in some facts and some costs so you understand not just what the ideas are, but the consequences, both intended and unintended, of those decisions and how they can affect your city's bottom line from a fiscal perspective. So the suggestions that we ultimately come up with in working with you all on implementing policy and different tools that you can use are intended to help leverage more property tax revenue that fund your needs and fund some of the initiatives that you might want to pursue, because of course programs that you can create often have some sort of cost associated with them. Expansions of staff have costs associated with them. Different ordinances and provisions that you built in might have different costs associated with those. And so as decision makers, we feel, ultimately it's up to you to make the decisions, but if we can give you as much information as possible at your fingertips, it helps the decision-making process. And then lastly, we try to identify some incremental and low-cost ways again, to leverage the resources that you have now, because that's what is critically important and that's what you have available to you. So one of the metrics that we look at is what we call revenue per acre. This is a way that we understand what parts of Alpine or any other community we're working with are actually showing the most profit to the community. Now, that is not to say that this exercise is intended to penalize parts of your community or to say that certain types of land development patterns are bad or negative. Rather, it's an understanding of what's really working well and making sure that those good things are nurtured as you move forward, and other things that may not have a net revenue to them, but are valuable to your community in other ways, such as quality of life, are maintained because we can kind of understand the costs of them. It's akin to having a personal portfolio of investments. You don't want to put all of your eggs in one basket, so to speak, but it's important for you to understand how all the different parts of your portfolio work together to give you a net picture that is profitable. Here's an example of one that we did recently for the city of Sweetwater. And by looking at revenue per acre, we learned some important things about how different sizes of properties are contributors, how different elements contribute to a resource gap. That is the gap between the demands that you're trying to meet and the resources at your disposal to meet them. Every city has a gap, but most cities have not quantified that gap. And so that's something that we help you do. So it isn't just a large number that we're talking around, but we don't really know what it is. We can actually quantify that number for you. This also removes exempt parcels from the equation, so it doesn't skew the results. And this is somewhat similar to the idea of a business that doesn't simply report the amount of dollars that it took in last year. It takes those dollars and then it subtracts its overhead costs and it subtracts the various expenses it incurred throughout the year. And so this is something that we help communities do at many different levels. We can go as deep or as big picture as you like to understand truly what the revenues are, not just the property values themselves, which are not the best indicator. And the ability to compare properties is another critical element of looking at the revenue per acre. This, of course, is a citywide view. It's a very big picture view. So another element of this that we often do is we look at it on a per parcel basis and we look at different development patterns. This is an example that we did recently working with the city of Dalhart to do a comprehensive plan. We compared some of their development patterns that they had naturally there. They had a nearby city with a big box. They had some conventional strip mall development in their community, and then they had their traditional downtown. And so we actually did the math to help them understand which development patterns were producing the most, and to understand on those that weren't, how there might be ways to help them produce more in the future. People build what we require them to build most of the time. And we often find with a lot of our clients that with redevelopment, it's important to re-examine what we're requiring people to build so that we can actually positively affect our bottom line. As of course, property tax revenue in Texas is a huge contributor to general fund revenues and is a pretty predictable source of revenue in terms of being able to estimate it, but we also can have an effect on the way it is generated and to what degree. So these are some brief examples, and it's something that we could get into more later if you're so inclined. But I do want to now shift our attention slightly to the purpose of tonight's workshop primarily, which is to talk about, as I was asked to prepare, 2 different planning tools that you have at your disposal that you can utilize for the city. It all starts with the fundamental question of understanding why cities plan and why that is necessary to do. All of you are probably convinced to some degree that planning is important, but nonetheless, planning is something that's really important to help cities be well equipped for challenges. We always have challenges that are anticipated, and inevitably there will be unanticipated challenges that we encounter during our process forward as a city, regardless of the size. And so by planning, by taking a look at things that are conditions on the ground today, by understanding with the data, what is working well, what's not working, what can be improved, we can actually become more resilient and better weather those challenges as they come to us, which they inevitably will. It also helps to focus efforts. We often do a lot of public engagement in communities, and one of the biggest things that we hear from residents is they say we really don't necessarily feel like we're seeing progress. Now, that's a very subjective view. Everyone's going to define progress differently. Everyone is going to have different levels of involvement where they're actually in a position to see progress. But nonetheless, in order to really make that tangible progress that can be showcased and highlighted and reported to the community, efforts need to be focused. Planning also is something that's incredibly important to do things like influence and ensure the health, safety, and quality of life for the residents that you're there representing, to create these predictable conditions. In this case, predictability is a good thing. Businesses and developers and residents in a predictable environment know what to expect. They understand what's likewise expected of them. They understand what they will be receiving for their tax dollars and the way that those things will be provided. So predictability can be an important thing, but it's made more possible through good forward planning. Planning is also critical to making cities more efficient, more accessible, equitable, and profitable. Every property in town isn't going to check all of those boxes, but it's really about understanding the sum of the parts and the overall picture of the community at a specific point in time. And then how do we develop that to maximize those different elements moving forward? Addressing residents' issues is another one that we often get feedback on no matter where we're working. And so there's a real pleasure and a real satisfaction level in going through a planning effort in your community where residents can share their issues and frustrations and see those reflected in something. They might not be solved overnight, but they can actually see that they have been heard, that those things have been factored into a plan for the future, and that there's a strategy to achieve some of those things and make those things better. And then lastly, planning is really critical for securing the longevity and the resources that you have. We've worked with a number of different communities that have different degrees of being resource strapped or resource rich, but those things ebb and flow and aren't guaranteed. And so good planning can help maintain those or even improve upon those long term. One of the things that I think I say we as planners, as the community of planners across the state don't do very well is we have a tendency as a field to come into cities and ask big, broad, sweeping questions like, what do you want to be in the future? Where do you see yourselves in 25 years? So on and so forth. And it's not that those questions necessarily are without merit, but unfortunately, those questions are too often asked without likewise introducing this discussion and dialogue of trade-offs as part of that plan. So we give the public the impression that we can plan without limitation and all things can be if we just plan correctly. But we all know that that's not the way it works and trade-offs are necessary. So a planning process is also really valuable because it can help your residents understand why trade-offs are necessary. It can help ground conversations and dialogue. When we have a conversation about something and people are expressing their likes and dislikes, support and lack of support, often that is very emotionally fueled, it's very opinion driven. But when we can also introduce the cost of things and the impact on our fiscal health as a community, it can actually ground that conversation and make it a much more productive one. Which was what the presentation I did at the TML Small Towns Conference, where I met your representatives, was about. And so there's a lot that can be done with that. We have to emphasize to our residents the importance of long-term costs and impacts. It's really easy to forget about something that we may not see in our immediate lifetime or even within the next few years, because as humans, we are focused on the here and now and not always thinking out further. But thinking about future generations, thinking about future budget cycles, thinking about future councils and future groups of citizens is a really important part of the planning process. So the graphic we have here is one that we designed almost 10 years ago, and we find it used all the time on social media and people sharing it, which we encourage, because the point of the graphic is kind of a tongue-in-cheek way of reminding us that everyone wants it all, but it's very difficult, if not impossible, to give everyone everything they want. So you may have residents that really want stable services. You may also have residents that want everything to be low density. They don't want, any smaller lots. They don't want apartments. They want low taxes. They don't want taxes to go up. But we don't often talk enough about the trade-offs that we have to make to get at some of the things that we want, and how sometimes we have to choose from those wants. Because the bottom line is having it all without limitation is a fallacy. And so we try to plan with that in mind, to be very realistic about the limitations and plan within those, so that you're not handed a plan at the end of a process like I often was, that is something that is completely unrealistic and not attainable. So let's talk a little bit about these two types of planning tools. The first is the strategic plan, and I'm going to run you through some of the different attributes of strategic plans. The first thing we're going to talk about is just what is it? In short, plain English, it is a roadmap. It's a roadmap for an organization specifically to reach its goals, and it's done with a short timeline. So it generally is either done annually or it's done between a 2 to 5 year time frame. It is intended to be a short-term document, and kind of the theme, if I had to give one to the strategic plan, is about getting things done. And who's involved in the strategic plan process? Well, it's often developed by key staff and officials. Often this is done with outside facilitation and assistance. Doesn't have to be that way. Of course, especially communities that have the benefit of having a larger staff, they may be able to do that in-house. But even then, sometimes cities will want to have kind of an outside perspective, someone that is, kind of free of any bias about the community, and that can sort of act as a mediator and a facilitator to guide the governing body through the planning process, and then encapsulating what they came up with in something that is tangible and something that is permanent and can be utilized. There are also other types of organizations that use strategic plans. It's not just really a city hall tool. Chambers of commerce, Main Street offices, nonprofit organizations, regional groups, economic development corporations. These are all just a few examples of the kinds of organizations that embark on this road of strategic planning. What's in the strategic plan? Well, there are several different parts. Metrics and or benchmarks are a common feature of strategic plans. The idea being that in order to know where you're going, you've got to know where you've been, and you need to be able to track what you're accomplishing, and be able to demonstrate that and kind of share that with people inside the organization and even people outside of the organization. It focuses on short-term priorities, again, anywhere from 1 to 5 years. And it takes the good ideas that city leaders have, whether that is elected officials, maybe some appointed officials are in the room, and some staff members, and it sorts and prioritizes those ideas and organizes them in a way that they can be achievable. And then it really outlines and presents the vision, the mission, the goals, and the actions of the organization. So anyone that picks up that document can very quickly at a glance understand what the organization's about and what they're trying to achieve. And ultimately, the purpose of the strategic plan, or what it's meant to do, is to achieve alignment between the resources that you have and the goals and activities that you want to pursue as a city, to achieve the goals that you have quickly and effectively, while incorporating other related documents that you may have in place. So for example, if you have a goal in your strategic plan that is economic development specific, and perhaps the city has an economic development plan somewhere, it would incorporate that into your work plan so that it's not happening in a vacuum. It's incorporating the different elements and the different sources of ideas and guidance that you may have already adopted. And ultimately, it is an organization-wide statement of the city of Alpine as the organization's future. And this, as city leaders, you'd use this to guide your plan of work for the next few years. You can use it to maintain accountability because it's a work plan. So it would be a recurring part of your meetings, your agendas, to maintain sort of this accountability and transparency about where you're going, what you've achieved, and to document the accomplishments, those really good things that you were able to check off, but also to document setbacks, which is also really important because it may uncover some obstacles that you need to address. And likewise, those setbacks might be because there needs to be some recalibration about the direction. So those are some of the basic elements of the strategic plan. And so we're now going to kind of go through the same categories as it relates to the comprehensive plan. Now, I like to say comprehensive plans are truly comprehensive, hence the name, in 3 different ways. First of all, they are a citywide look at a community, everything within the city's boundaries. Secondly, they are comprehensive in the types of subject matter that they examine, and we're going to talk about some of those specifically here in a moment. And then thirdly, they're comprehensive because they truly include everyone in the community. So we'll delve into those a little bit more here shortly. But what is it? Essentially, it is looking into the future, and generally, traditionally, that's 15 to 20 years for comprehensive plans. I will say that we typically recommend looking at a shorter time frame. If there's anything that the past few years have taught us, we cannot know everything that's going to happen, and we cannot anticipate every challenge that we may encounter. So we actually prefer to look at a little bit shorter time period, so that we can make sure that the plan really stands up to the test of time. It's a plan that satisfies statutory requirements in Texas. So the local government code, chapter 213 in particular, talks about comprehensive plans in Texas. It's a short chapter, but it's an important one because it tells us what the purpose of communities using comprehensive plans is for. It tells us what can be in a comprehensive plan. And one benefit of the way the statute's written is it does give a great deal of flexibility. And we're going to talk in a few minutes about why flexibility is so important to be able to customize a plan to fit what you truly need in your community and your situation. It can do some very specific things like look at land use, look at transportation, but can also be evolving with the community. So it may incorporate other types of topics. And so the statute doesn't preclude any of those things from happening. It simply gives you the guideline that you may look at those. The statute also authorizes Texas cities to enact and adopt a comprehensive plan. It's not required, but if a city does choose to do so, it does have to follow the statutory language. And it is also an important basis for things like land use development regulations, which we'll touch on too. So there are some features of this that are embedded in state law. The comprehensive planning process also looks at ways to support a community-wide vision. And so that is an important piece that is a little bit different from the strategic plan. So who's involved in this type of planning process is a little different. As I said, comprehensive in that it involves everyone. Generally, the way this is done is that consultants report to the governing body and develop the plan based on the input of citizens in the community, the city staff, the governing body, the various boards and commissions that you have there locally, and any community partners, just to name a few examples. Now, as I mentioned with strategic plans, it's not necessary that you have a consultant perform this for you, but often cities have so many things going on for their staff that it's difficult to actually set aside and earmark time for something that's this encompassing. We always joked as city employees, you know, the work doesn't stop. You can't shut off the water, so to speak. things will continue to come in the door day in and day out. And so the appeal of hiring someone to come in and assist you with this is that they are able to dedicate that time while you continue to focus on city operations. Now, the parts of a comprehensive plan are also far reaching compared to the strategic plan. So one of the first things that it does is it takes a snapshot in time. It's meant to capture where your community is at the time the plan is done. And it does this by incorporating some existing conditions there in the community, by doing various inventories of things that you have, different assets, that sort of thing. Looking at who lives in your community. What are the demographic makeups of people there? What are the different income levels? What are the different things that help us understand who we're planning for? And then what is the vision of the community? But not just what the vision is, what are the goals? And then the specific actions that help us achieve that vision. Without all of those pieces in place, a vision is a wish. And so the goals and actions are necessary to make it something tangible and achievable. That snapshot in time is also supported by a great deal of research and mapping and analysis to really understand all the different components that make up your community. Every community is sort of a microcosm of lots of different elements. And so it's important to understand what those are there. And there are generally areas of focus, and those can, as we've talked about per state statute, those can fluctuate and vary. But some of the most common ones are land use and mobility or transportation, sometimes housing as well. And then lastly, this sorting and prioritizing of community ideas. So that comprehensive approach to engagement that brings everyone in the community together to share ideas, to uncover issues, to identify obstacles, that is then sorted and prioritized to lay out the strategy for your path forward. So as you can see, it is a very comprehensive, very all-encompassing document. And what it does is it guides the community's growth for development and redevelopment while casting that long-term vision and lining out the framework for how to get there. That framework can talk about decision making, how different elements need to come together to make that vision applicable. And unlike the strategic plan, that is really a statement of the organization's goal, this is a citywide statement of the community's future. It's used by city leaders such as you to also guide your plan of work in a different way at a higher level. You can use it to track and report progress to the community. And it should also help influence the different investments that you make for potentially some of the infrastructure choices, some of the budgeting decisions, the policy that you have in place and the tools that you give the staff, different projects and partnerships, programs that you might build, all of those things. Another thing that's really a little different about the comprehensive plan is the way that it's intended to evolve over time. So we always refer to this as the life cycle of a comprehensive plan. And one thing you'll note right away is that it is a cycle that doesn't have a beginning and an end. It's an ongoing cycle. The reason that that's really important is because your city is a never-ending cycle. It's always in flux. It's always changing and growing. And so a plan, to be really useful, has to have a great balance of casting that vision and laying out the path forward while also being adaptive to the changes and some of those unanticipated challenges we talked about earlier that are going to crop up whether we like it or not. And so the cycle really begins with this idea of assessing the needs of the community, which is much of the planning process, and engaging the public in that, making recommendations that then are translated into tangible actions, and then implementing those and repeating that over and over and over again. Now, we generally recommend for communities doing a comprehensive plan that they look at it either annually or every 2 years to sort of take stock in what's been accomplished and talk through that and acknowledge that, because that's really important. To update the plan where maybe it has fallen short or perhaps it's now out of step with what's currently going on. to check off the things that are completed and come up with some new ideas for forward movement. So that's something that's always a critical part of the comprehensive planning process. And as I mentioned before, one of the great things about the way that we have this framework in Texas is that it does provide flexibility. Now, if you go back and you look at the 1950s through the 1980s, kind of the era where comprehensive planning was growing and changing, there's a very traditional approach that's often used that looks something kind of like this. It's a plan made up of lots of different thick chapters that address different subject matters. Annexation, when cities had a lot more unilateral annexation authority, that was often a fixture that you would regularly see. Chapters about infrastructure and housing and facilities, parks and trails, things of that nature are often very big components of a traditional comprehensive plan. And then in recent years, the last 25, 30 years, we're also seeing a lot of plans include things like urban form or urban design. That doesn't fit every context. It might be a neighborhood focus and other communities, different levels of looking at the environment and sustainability. So this has morphed and changed over time, but the traditional approach is to really try to touch anything and everything that's part of the community. But what we've often found in the field and as time has moved on is that it really is something to have focused efforts and really hone in on maybe what are the two or three big areas that are on the city's radar today. And so we emphasize that this is a traditional approach because it doesn't have to be the approach that you utilize. So here's sort of a chart that compares and contrasts the strategic plan and the comprehensive plan so that you can easily see some of the differences there. Just to review, the strategic plan is micro or small in scale. It's really organization focused, whereas the comprehensive plan is very large in scale and looking at the entire community and everyone within it. And in contrast, the strategic plan has those shorter term outcomes with a specific and narrow scope. In contrast, the comprehensive plans are longer term outcomes and a general all-encompassing scope. Strategic plans are focused inward because they are organizational focused, or sometimes they are also topic focused. So for example, an economic development commission may have an economic development strategic plan that is just a plan focused on their organization within the greater city network and that particular topic. On the other hand, comprehensive plans are both outwardly focused because we're looking at the entire community and inwardly focused at the same time because we're examining how the organization works with the greater community, how they affect one another, really understanding the way that those two entities work cohesively or not, and how that can be improved upon. Strategic plans are centered on governance, and comprehensive plans are centered on assessments and policy setting, really setting the tone for how you're going to attack different issues. The strategic plan is generally, as I mentioned earlier, developed by the governing body with the assistance of a facilitator or expert there to help get through the process and produce the ultimate document. On the other hand, comprehensive plans are generally developed by a facilitator or expert with input and engagement of the governing body, who essentially is running the show, and also incorporating the opinions and thoughts of officials and citizens and community partners. And then lastly, strategic plans are not addressed in state law, so you're free to some degree to have quite a bit of flexibility with how you utilize those tools and when you do those and if you do them. And comprehensive plans are addressed to some part, in state law with some parameters set, but allowing you some ability to change that and adapt it to fit your needs, which is really where we're going to end with wrapping up here. The question ultimately that you'll all be asking yourselves is what elements should go in your plan if you decide to move forward with a planning effort? This is a big question, and it's probably one of the biggest challenges to overcome at conferences. This is probably the most frequently asked question that we field, because the belief is that there's just a pat list of things that answers this question. But the answer to this question truly is whatever is most helpful to your situation, that's what should go in your plan. There really isn't one right way to do this. And frankly, a planning effort is something that has a cost associated with it. And so cities naturally want to get the most bang for their buck, and be able to defend the way that they make funding decisions about planning. And so it often is helpful to be able to say we focused on the things that we truly needed and we left out the things that we didn't. I know as a former client of plans, I would often get those, and realistically, there were at least 2 or 3 chapters that we really didn't use, and we referred to those as the fluff. And so, trying to kind of have a no fluff approach to planning and identifying what you really need is what's going to help you be most effective and efficient with your resource spending on the effort, and for you to just feel like you really got what you needed, no more and no less. So, Virginity, the way that we approach this is we actually do a hybrid plan. So, if you um, do a plan with us, and we'll talk about some of the clients that we've worked with, we actually mix elements of a strategic plan, a comprehensive plan, and an incremental action plan together into one document. The reason that we do that is because we don't feel the need to piecemeal that approach. And often those things will inform one another. And so you can do those cohesively. It also allows us to do what we like to do, which is to utilize that land use fiscal analysis as kind of the centerpiece, the lens, to align the vision of the community with the policies that you have to work with, the budget that you're operating with, the actions that you're carrying out and that you're asking others to carry out. And you're balancing that with what can reasonably be paid for now and in the future rather than pie in the sky. There are no limitations in our planning efforts. But regardless of how you decide to move forward, one of the best pieces of advice we often give people, and one of the things that we always do, is to get to know the different aspects of the community and let that drive what the plan should actually take shape as, because communities are different and one plan does not fit all. And so these are 5 areas that we often look at to help our clients understand what sort of plan they might need. For example, we look at the level of growth. So on one end of the spectrum, you might have a community that their population is declining. On the other end of the spectrum, you might have a rapid growth community. And the solutions are not going to be the same for those 2 different types of communities. They're going to have very different needs. The same with the type of environment, a rural community, a suburban community, a regional hub. Again, one plan does not fit all of those. They will need different strategies to be successful in their respective environments. We also say look at the economic drivers in your community. One of the clients that we're currently working with has what we call economic singularity. They have one major industry that drives the entire economy of that community. And so that is a very different challenge to plan for than on the other end of the spectrum, a community that has lots of different major employers and industries that drive its community's economy. The age of the community. A fairly new community is going to have different needs than one that's long established. And then lastly, experience of leadership. There's nothing wrong with wherever people land on the spectrum, but kind of a newer leadership team is going to need a different approach to planning than one that's very experienced and has been in the community for a long time. So understanding where your community fits in these different areas is critical to making sure you get the plan that actually accomplishes what you need it to. And to kind of illustrate that point, we've shared 3 different communities that we've worked with recently that fall all along different parts of those spectrums. And so the approaches had to be very different. On the left is Parsons, Kansas. This is a rural community in far southeast Kansas that is experiencing a declining population, has that economic singularity we talked about, very dependent on one sector, and has some practical difficulties because they are a far-flung community. So they had a very specific set of circumstances that they needed a plan that would appreciate, acknowledge, and work within. We're proud of that one because it was awarded a plan award in 2022 through a national group that looks at small town and urban, I'm sorry, small town and rural rather plans across the United States. The second example is Sweetwater, Texas, which you're probably very familiar with. On I-20, it's just under 11,000 people. They have an interesting population. Some years it ticks up slightly, other years it ticks down slightly, but it's largely stagnant. They have a lot of different economic drivers in their community, but they had some other issues that were specific to them, things like vacant land and vacant buildings and trying to revitalize their neighborhoods. And so their focus and their plan would not have fit Parsons. And that one we also were fortunate to get recognition for. And then the last one that we share as an example is Liberty Hill, Texas, which is a small community of 6,800. Just 4 short years ago, their population was only half that. They are on the cusp of rapid and expansive growth as they get spillover from the larger Austin metro area. So their needs were very different from the other two communities. And so this example is really just intended to emphasize the importance of knowing yourselves and understanding what your priorities are, the things you really want to work on first, and what won't work for you, which is just as important as knowing what will. So there are a few options I was asked to kind of summarize for you as you start to think ahead and potentially move forward in a planning process of some sort. The first option is what I talked about just a moment ago, where you actually combine the strategic planning and the comprehensive planning together in a singular effort. The pros of that are you do it as a singular effort that is unified. It ties those pieces together, they work in tandem with one another, and you can also have the benefit of continuity because you can actually work with one group that could do both of those things for you at the same time. It also allows that fiscal analysis element, if you're so inclined and interested in that, to really be a focal point of both the community-wide planning effort and the organization's planning efforts, so that they're both tied to this idea of what can we afford reasonably, what resources do we have, and what resources do we not have currently? How do we work within the constraints that we face? The cons of that are really just it requires a very engaged group from start to finish because it's a bigger commitment over time to engagement. So engagement would be happening throughout the process, throughout the planning horizon. And so it is kind of an intense and fast-paced at times effort to do those things simultaneously, but it does allow a great deal of public engagement, which is often a good thing, especially when you're showing off to the community what you're hoping to accomplish and later on what you have all achieved. The second way you could go would be to do a standalone strategic plan first and then come back later and do a comprehensive plan. The obvious pro to this one is you get your work plan, your plan for the next year, 2 years, whatever time frame you decide on, you get that in motion very quickly. But the cons on that are that it is sort of done, not in a vacuum per se, but it's done within the confines of City Hall. And so you may find later that there were things that the community brought to light that you wished that you had had to consider when you were doing the strategic plan. And it doesn't tie that work plan to what the community wants. So those are a couple of things to consider. And then, of course, the third option is to flip that order and pursue a citywide comprehensive plan first, and then come back later and do a strategic plan for the organization. The pro of that is that you cast that community vision early on, but it does delay the implementation of the plan as you then shift gears to the strategic plan. So it can actually take longer for the community and you leading the community to be able to ramp up the implementation process. So that is one kind of con of that. But these are three different ways that you can look at the sort of choreography of how you might want to move forward with a planning process. So with that, I know we've covered a lot of ground in a short amount of time, but I wanted to respect your time constraints. So thank you very much for that. And at this point, I'm going to open it up for any questions that any of you might have. I'd be happy to delve further into those with you, but thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you so much. Okay, we have 9 minutes, council, to ask questions. We'll start with Councilmember Stevens.
Mayor, thanks very much. I have 2.5 questions, if I can use a half a question. The first question is, what's the cost for option one typically? And what's the normal timeline for preparation? That's question number one. And question number two, looking at the code, comprehensive plans are really interesting and they certainly follow the legislation, but each time you change over people, there's nothing that says it has to be followed because new leadership could cause it to change. What's your experience with that? So those are my 2.5 questions.
Okay, those are both excellent questions. The first one about cost is I promise not me trying to answer a question with a question, but the scope dictates the budget. So there's three things that are most probably expensive when you're putting together a scope for something like this. That is the level of engagement. So how much can the city itself do versus how much of the consultant is needed to do that? That can set one big part of it. The second thing is travel. So we always recommend trying to maximize trips and just cram as much as we can into them. So you're paying for one trip and you're getting as much stuff as you can out of that trip, stuff being meetings and interviews and engagement opportunities, workshops like this, that sort of thing. Now, of course, these days we can do a lot of things virtually. So being able to mix those two can also help with that cost and some mitigation of it. And then the third thing that is the biggest driver in the expense is the scope. So how broad do you want it to be? What different areas of focus do you want to encompass? The broader the focus, the bigger the price tag, the narrower the focus, the smaller the price tag. I will tell you, just as a frame of reference, of the three plans that I showed you earlier as examples, the first one ran around $90,000. The second one ran around $100,000, and the third one was closer to $400,000. And that was because they wanted a ton of engagement and they had no staff to do any of it themselves. So that shows you how much it can fluctuate. But we really like to find out kind of what's available and tell you what you can get for that. So we're happy to do that. The second question about continuity is a great one as well. I've been on both sides of that, having worked in cities where that transition has occurred and working as a consultant with cities where that transition has occurred. And it is a difficult process, but state law is pretty clear about if you do have a comprehensive plan adopted, you got to follow it. Now, it's more specific about things like land use and less specific about things like governance. However, if the process, and where I've seen this be most successful, is processes where engagement was robust, because the more people that were part of and had a seat at the table during the process, the more likely those people are to help remind that this was the course of action we all agreed to. That first community that I mentioned in Kansas, they had an interesting transition occur not long after the plan was put into play and it was adopted. And the community actually was very vocal in coming to the council and saying, look, we understand that new people bring new ideas to the table, but this is the path that we were all part of. And so if it needs to be re-examined, that's fine. But we really need to stick with this. And so, that's part of the beauty of having it as a visible process, is it helps maintain that level of accountability. And the council, of course, has a great deal of responsibility in being able to direct the city staff as to how to follow that comprehensive plan. So you can't bulletproof it, but you can certainly help it have a higher likelihood of success based on the way the approach is calibrated to fit the community.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Then we have 4 minutes remaining.
The time frame, she didn't answer the time.
Oh, time frame.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you for keeping me honest on that. We have seen anywhere from 12 to 14 months for a very small community. A medium-sized community would be between 18 to 24 months. I think for the size of a city like Alpine, I would say anywhere from 12 to 16 months, depending on things like the holidays. That's usually the thing that is the hardest.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. All right, Councilmember Nance.
One question I had is strategic plans. We have issues with zoning just from like historically having some spot zones in the past. Would correcting zoning be an example of a strategic plan?
No, generally that would be a directive that would come from your comprehensive plan. So the comprehensive plan, and the reason that in Texas it's actually addressed in statute, the origins of that are because of the land use feature of that. So you'd have a future land use map is what it's generally called. It can have different names, but it is essentially the vision for land use in the community. And then your zoning decisions must follow that vision that you've cast. So that's how you align the vision for the community with the zoning that you have on the ground. And so once you have that vision in place through a comprehensive plan, you can work with landowners to pursue those land changes, or in the state of Texas, of course, you as a governing body can actually initiate some of those if you so choose.
Councilmember Martinez.
I have a question on your experience, what do you work best to combine both at the same time, or start one and then the other one? Or the options that you give us to the council?
I would always recommend combining them when you can, because I've been in the shoes of being the staff person trying to find money and get money approved to do something like this. And it's really hard to do that once, much less twice. And so there is some economies of scale if you do it together, because you can customize the engagement to kind of get at both of those things. So when we do them, we actually do it as one cohesive process. We don't actually say today we're going to focus on the strategic plan, tomorrow the comprehensive plan. It all actually rolls up under the comprehensive plan, but a lot of the research, the analysis, and the things that we do that is comprehensive plan focused can actually inform what you all as a body want to put into your work plan for yourselves. And so those things working together can actually make sure that a lot of things don't fall through the cracks.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we have less than a minute left. Councilmember Stone, did you have a question? Okay, any other questions from council that you want to ask?
Sorry.
This is very open meeting.
Okay, all right, thank you so very much. We appreciate you presenting this information to us this evening.
Thank you. And I'll mention, this is a lot to think on. So if you think of questions later, I'm sure that I could work with your city manager to get you some additional answers, and would be happy to do so.
I have like 12 questions, so I'll call you.
Okay, great. I look forward to catching up.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank
With
you.
that, it's
Thank you all. Have a
Thanks,
good
Adrian.
evening.
Thank you. And the workshop is adjourned.